This is Writers on Film, the only podcast dedicated to books on cinema. Hello everybody and welcome to Writers on Film. My name is John Bleasdale. I'm a writer and film critic, and today I'm delighted to be talking to Glenn Kenny, the author of The World Is Yours, the story of Scarface. Glenn is an old friend of the pod, in fact a very old friend, not in terms of age. I don't want to imply anything rude about Mr. Kenny, but in the fact that he was one of our first guests right at the very beginning of the podcast. And the podcast, which has been going now for over 150 episodes, has got to the point where somebody has had time to go away, write a book, and come back and be on the podcast for a second occasion. So that's amazing. I'm really pleased to have him on. He tells a really interesting story about the making of what would become a classic in gangster films. If you enjoy the episode, please remember to like. You could spread it across social media if you so please. If you leave a review, that's very, very helpful. And also, if you want to try checking out Cinema Italia, the other podcast that I'm running. I'll soon also be running a podcast, the James Bond Book Club, which I'm currently recording. I'll be releasing as soon as I have a few episodes lined up for you. But before you do any of that, please enjoy the conversation.
You're wearing almost something like a Miami version of a Hawaiian shirt. Yeah,
exactly. just, and I'm just rewatched Scarface last night in preparation for
that
this.
shirt that Manny's wearing in the scene near the end where they're having the argument over the security cameras. That is a shirt I was wondering if I could try and find a version of that before my book event on Tuesday at Mysterious Bookshop, but it looks kind of like a specialty item. It's pretty garish. I really like it with those white pants. Stephen Bauer could really rock that Miami casual wear in a way that no one else could.
You see, that's the problem, isn't it? It's like, I love Pacino's shirt when he goes into the hotel at the very beginning, the first act. But the problem is, if I wore it, it would be, 51-year-old dad wearing it, but Pacino
you got to be able to pull it off.
You've got to be
frankly,
Pacino.
Pacino. The great thing about Pacino in this movie is that he always, no matter how well he dresses, he always looks like a striver. And Stephen Bauer is so slick and sleek. When he wears that stuff, it's like, it's effortless. I
think my surprise on watching the film with your book in my head as well was I kind of never the character of Tony Montana had grown to such a degree that I didn't even really recognize him as a character. There's a sort of like, if somebody is an icon, they lose the complexity of character. They become a sort of Mickey Mouse silhouette. And watching him through your eyes, I sort of found him a much more compelling persona.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because, Pacino is definitely, Pacino was inspired to make the movie because he was so affected by Paul Muni's performance in the 1932 picture. That really knocked him for a loop and showed him something that he wanted to do as an actor. And Muni's performance as Tony Comante is unlike anything Muni did after that film, where despite the virtuosity of his work and care and meticulousness, was never as reckless. Never as just go for broke as that. And I think what Pacino saw here was an opportunity to do a real go for broke kind of performance, and just but he does. There is within any given scene, he does do things that, seem like recognizably human responses, but within the mode of this guy who's just, completely monomaniacal. And one thing he did during the shooting of the film was he just kept trying different approaches. There's this, when I spoke to the editor, David Ray, he told me, he could have created, maybe a half a dozen different Tony Montanas out of the takes that Pacino did, because it would always be different. And it almost was difficult for him to create a coherent character while he was going through all the different iterations of Montana that Pacino was serving up.
That's such a fascinating process as well, and it sort of goes against what DePalma is doing in a sense because he's much more of a we've got the shot director.
Well, in this case, he was not working under his own steam. He was very candid about the fact that this was something that he was doing for hire, and he wanted to do two things specifically, which was to, honor Stone's script, which he thought was good, keep his producer happy, which meant keeping the producer's star happy, and apply his own sense of epic narrative and visual sweep to this story without, applying too much of his own personal quirks to it. There's some of the things we find that are trademark De Palma are notably absent from the movie. Last night we had a screening of it, and I found the single. There's one diopter shot, one split diopter shot in the movie, and it goes by very fast. But usually in a De Palma film, you'll find, six, seven, eight of those. Split screen is not in this film. A lot of those stylistic signatures are absent, but but which isn't to say that the movie's not stylized. It's an unbelievably stylized film. But yeah, getting the shot was not was a longer process, and then it became the job of the editors to take the shots and make the scene. A lot of times directors will do one thing that Joe Reedy, the first AD on Goodfellas, told me when I was writing Made Men, my prior book about the story of Goodfellas, is that a lot of the times when directors call for multiple takes, it's not because they're displeased with the actors, it's because the scene isn't coming together the way they want it to, and they think if they keep trying it, they'll get that. In the case of Scarface, the one who wanted the multiple takes was Pacino. And both Stephen Bauer and Michelle Pfeiffer told me, despite the fact that this process drew out the shooting schedule and to unconscionable lengths, they say, if an actor has the power to do that, an actor can do it and possibly should do it. And Michelle Pfeiffer noted that when they were doing Frankie and Johnny with Gary Marshall, Pacino was kind of less insistent in certain respects about this idea, but he still wanted it. He still wanted the freedom to do more takes and find the character. Because it's like he loves the stage, and he says, being on stage, he compares it to, the Wallendas. It's like you want to be on the wire and everything else in your life is waiting. And if he's sitting there creating a character, take after take after take after take, that for him is being on the wire.
It reminds me of that sort of. Have you heard that Jack Nicholson story of A Few Good Men, where he does all the the camera's on Tom Cruise and he's done his bit, and it's like, well, you don't need to read the lines for Tom, and he's like, no, and he reads a lot. He does his part for Tom, and he does
absolutely, yeah. De Niro does that too. The legendary story of Raging Bull, when Jake LaMotta is interrogating Joe Pesci. And, asking, did you sleep with my wife? Obviously in saltier language. But De Niro is there doing it. And in fact, he's making it worse. He's like, did you sleep with your mother? Just because he wants to get the reaction from Pesci, and it works, that kind of like, what did you say?
And Nicholson says at the end of the thing, I love acting. It's just that thing of like that verb of well, why wouldn't you if that's the thing you enjoy the most? Why wouldn't you put yourself out there and do it as much as possible?
Yeah, you're an actor.
Yeah.
I mean, Nicholson happened to be an actor who commanded great, amounts of money and great amounts of deference. But yeah, he likes to act.
Absolutely, absolutely. Let's go back to the very beginning, because I love the way this book started when you're talking about the amendment to the Constitution as being, something which tells a story in and of itself, and how Prohibition invents the gangster film. more or
Yeah, I mean,
less.
that was an interesting thing for me to delve into. We don't always think about it that way, but yeah, I mean, once I looked at Raoul Walsh's The Roaring Twenties and saw that, oh, for this we actually have to go back in time to give us the motor of the plot. We're like, oh yeah, these gangster movies all relied on prohibition, and you find after prohibition that they have, different ways of going. But White Heat is a different kind of gangster film than Public Enemy because the tenor of the crime committed. But prohibition and bootlegging, they created a whole industry of not just bootlegging, but gangster movies because that was a real easy thing to people automatically knew what they were talking about.
Mm.
And also the fact that Capone was such a legendary figure, a pop culture icon.
And you get,
And those were the twin motors that drove the gangster film in the 1930s.
I mean, yeah, I guess before that you really just have bank robbers and Bonnie
Yeah,
and Clyde and that sort of outlawry.
yeah, which we didn't start exploring until later on. You couldn't make folk heroes about no studio, despite the fact that there was no production code. There's no studio that would have made a movie lionizing Bonnie and Clyde at the time. Maybe a couple of William Wellman pictures had similar kinds of outlaw protagonists, but not quite those guys. But the bootlegger was a folk hero because the prohibition was wildly unpopular. They were seen as providing a service, despite the fact that it was done through means that were absolutely dirty and abhorrent and ruthless.
It sort of twins this film for me. Again, it was a film that sort of pops up a number of times in your book with sort of crossover relationships as well, with Once Upon a Time in America, the Sergio Leone movie, which of course is absolutely steeped in prohibition as well, with a coffin at the
Yeah.
beginning. Sort of.
And it becomes a business. The James Wood character eventually, after getting rid of all his buddies from the back in the day, recreates himself as a businessman and a politico. And this is a theme that is explored in Scarface, where Tony Montana is constantly complaining about how he's being screwed by the system when his banker starts telling him about the 10% rates he's got to charge. He is a businessman. We don't, and we, that's the interesting thing. He seems, for the most part in the picture, he seems just this unstoppable feral brute force. But every now and then, like when he's negotiating with Sosa for the first time or talking with the banker, you see he's reasonably smart about this kind of thing. He does have a sharp sense, and he does have that kind of classic old school Republican thing of I want to keep my money. I'm getting charged too much. I want to keep my money. This doesn't make sense, which is funny.
It's yeah. There's moments where even right at the very beginning, where he's sort of talking about how if he'd come here 10 years earlier, he would have been a millionaire. There's a
Yeah.
sense that he knows he knows how to set up a business. I wouldn't know how to be a millionaire. I wouldn't know how to profit by something, but he seems to have looked at the angles and worked it out quite easily.
It's complicated.
Mm.
It really is, and you have to have a kind of head for it early on. I never did, which is unfortunate. But yeah, no, he gets it. He's definitely got a head for numbers. Look at
So
the money counting scene where they're off by like maybe $1,000, and he's like, "Well, we're off by $1,000. Count it again." That's what you have to have.
yeah, yeah, no, there's no margin for error when it comes to my money. The big switch that they make when they start working on the remake is the switch from prohibition to the drug, cocaine specifically.
And that was suggested by Sidney Lumet. The original idea, and this is something that DePalma has a recollection of because it was quite some time before Stone wrote his script, but he remembers being approached by Bregman to write it with David Rabe and do it as a 1930s gangster thing, make it a period piece. And there were reasons that this didn't work out, and they walked away from the project. Then the project went to Lumet. Lumet was the guy who had the idea of saying, why do it in the 30s? Why make a period piece when we can do it in the contemporary cocaine trade? and Martin Bregman, the producer, and Al Pacino were both very enthusiastic about this idea, and they proceeded on that basis. And that was the thing that gave Oliver Stone his impetus. Stone himself at the time was pretty heavily into cocaine, so he knew the product. He then set about learning the business, and it helped because going down to Bimini and hanging out with drug dealers, you're generally invited to get high with them, which he was able to do. But then he realized he couldn't write while in this state, so he moved to Paris, where the product would be presumably more difficult to get, and it was, and kind of wrote the film more or less sober. He told me he went back to LA and was back in that culture of recreational drug use, and he did use cocaine again, but he said, I never got addicted to it again, which okay, it's feasible. But yeah, so that was invaluable, having that little monkey on his back to work with while he was researching it and finding out a lot of the things that are in the movie that seem, jaw-dropping, like sawing off people's limbs with chainsaws. That was a real thing. These people, this is a fierce competition, and because it's a fierce competition in a lawless enterprise, anything goes. And the sort of Latin American culture of the disdain for traitors, chivaros, and the revenge, that's all very real. And he saw that, not firsthand, but certainly close enough to scare the bejesus out of him and his partner at the time. And so he came back with that knowledge, and that's what gave him the impetus to write scenes like the one at the Sunray Motel with the Colombians, the toad and the lizard.
Yeah, which is going to be one of the most striking scenes of the film. I mean, it really, and as you sort of quite rightly say, everybody thinks they see far more than they actually see. I was interested in the editor's interview as well, where the editor was saying, I found it really difficult to actually edit that because I didn't want to watch it.
He doesn't like to watch it. It's upsetting to him, and he knows exactly how it's faked. That's the funny thing. He has intimate knowledge of what actually happened during the shoot, and he still finds it difficult. That's that's the magic of cinema, as they say. You really do create that impression. And then, as in Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho, no, you never see the blade touching skin. You do see Angie Dickinson's character get lacerated in Dressed to Kill. DePalma made that choice very specifically because, Dressed to Kill is such a guignol to begin with. But here he wanted to, he knew he didn't need to be that explicit. And even being as relatively nuanced in his approach here as he was, this was the scene that still threatened to give the movie an X rating.
Yeah, I mean it's absolute. Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not sure nuanced is exactly the word that springs to mind when I think of it. Something about the 1980s and chainsaws as well is just seems to be the weapon of choice.
Yeah, no. Well, it's a scary thing. The thing you have to remember about a chainsaw is that it only works while you're holding the throttle.
Yeah.
Once you let go of the throttle, it stops. So that's why chainsaws, they're not really safe instruments. You can get into mishaps, but remember, it's the throttle. When Christian Bale throws the chainsaw down the flight of stairs in American Psycho, it's still going as it goes flying in the air, and that's completely inaccurate.
One of the many things which is quite inaccurate in that film. I presume it's happening in his head, I guess.
Unbelievable.
When was the first time you watched Scarface as a punter?
I saw it when it came out in theaters.
Right. And what was your first impression of it?
I was stunned. It was a lot. The 80s, I was 23. No, I was 24. Huh. The 80s movies were a lot, which was part of what made the 80s kind of fun. Dressed to Kill was a lot. Blowout was a lot. I was a real DePalma fan. I saw anything he did, I would see. So we were my buddies and I were always first in line, and we were a little skeptical about this. And again, as I think I mentioned in the book, it didn't strike us as a DePalma film as such for the reasons I mentioned about different kinds of shots and not using split screen and so on. But we were just sort of like blown away. And at the very end, they put out this. There's that title card that says that this film is dedicated to Howard Hawks and Ben Hecht. And one of my friends just guffawed because everything that we had seen in that last shootout scene was so, in its own way, diametrically opposed to Howard Hawks and Ben Hecht that it seemed almost cheeky to include that dedication. And several film critics thought it was literally blasphemous. I now think that it was, sincerely meant. But again, this is such a departure. But it's not. But on the other hand, it's not too much of a departure because honestly, Scarface is the most over the top stylistically. Is the most stylistically over the top movie that Hawks ever made. And by the standard of its time, it was pretty remarkably violent. So, Hawks and Hecht, particularly Hecht, might be appalled by the standards of the time in the 80s being applied to the story. But there you have it. It's not inaccurate.
It's sort of crazy that gangster films as well have that DNA running through them, that they have to have the anti-hero who kills people in imaginative and demonstrative and theatrical ways. Usually, I'm just thinking of Jimmy Cagney and those lines about like, oh, you need some air, I'll give you a few holes or something,
Oh yeah, that's well, in White Heat where he shoots through the trunk.
Yeah.
Also, the fact of the gangsters feeling indestructible. What's interesting about Scarface is that when Tony Montana is under siege at the end, he's kept saying, you messing, you again, more colorful language, you messing with me, you mess with the best. And then he gets shot dozens of times and he's still standing, and it's crazy. And it reminds you of Cagney at the end of The Public Enemy, where he gets gunned down in the rain and he says, I ain't so tough. But he doesn't die. He dies when they come for him in the hospital and kill him and wrap him in a mummified way and stand him outside the door of his ancestral home, which is not very nice. But Pacino doesn't, Tony Montana doesn't die until he gets the shot in the back of the neck from someone he doesn't see. And that, when they were editing the film, DePalma told Jerry Greenberg, the editor, because he was saying, why doesn't he should be dead by now. And he's like, no, he's a vampire.
Right.
All right.
Right.
Well, that makes sense. And the shotgun at the back of the neck is the version of the wooden stake through the heart. Why not?
It also reminded me of David Simon, I think, in Homicide, writes a whole thing about how falling over when you've been shot is a learned response because you've seen it on TV. And if you're high on drugs, you lose that learned response. And so you can just carry on moving until they hit a major artery or a heart or a kneecap or something.
He's into it. Well, let's just bounce right through him. They just make the cocaine run through his veins that much faster.
Concentrate. So all the bullet wounds become orifices for him to take in more cocaine.
People have been asking me, it's the weirdest thing. So did they do a lot of coke on the set of this movie? I'm like, no. If they had people, the actual people would have died. First of all, Pacino had never done cocaine,
right,
and presumably never did after that. DePalma never touched cocaine. Of all the like Lucas and DePalma is practically abstemious. There's a reason you don't read about DePalma consuming a shit ton of drugs in any of Peter Biskin's account, and that reason is he didn't. He doesn't even behave. He didn't even behave badly in restaurants. So, these were not guys with a lot of experience. Stone had the experience. Bauer, to a certain extent, had the experience, and Bauer also had the experience of living with an addict because he was involved with the actor Melanie Griffith during a difficult time in her young life. So there was that. I don't think Michelle Pfeiffer had ever done it. And her way of acting coked up is different than most people because she just remains on the same sort of ice cold plane throughout. But yeah, you can't make this kind of movie on drugs. It's crazy.
I guess it's that thing of it being a movie in the 80s, and we all think, a lot of people have this idea of the 80s being this rampaging decade.
We think everybody took drugs. I'll tell you a story not related to the film. I was having dinner many years ago with a group of friends, several of them in the film industry, screenwriters, producers. One's now a studio head, and one of our friends was a musician and composer and for a time a record producer, and was telling us of the time when he was producing two albums at once, both by really renowned and respected artists, but they were on the timetable was, one artist would record, in the morning, and then he would drive across LA to the other studio, and the other artist would record in the evening. And somebody said, "Wow, you must have been doing a lot of coke to get that done." And he said, "I've never done cocaine." And everybody at the table was very ashamed.
Yeah, I mean, you need a lot of sleep more than anything if you're
Yeah,
gonna
yeah,
if you're gonna
yeah.
do that sort of you need nap time, which is what something Brian De Palma, as you point out.
Brian De Palma loved his naps. I mean, Stone is I think Oliver Stone is a different conception of directing from Brian, and that what led to Stone's observations in his book about De Palma being kind of like a inactive director. He's not a director who gets up and orchestrates and rallies the troops. He's always
Mm,
thinking about getting the shot. He's meticulous and he's detailed, and he delegates so that everything is in place for what he wants. He's storyboarded it. uh you know Movies, what did Bresson say? Movies begin in my head. They die when I write the script, and they're even more dead when I shoot it, but once I edit it, they come back to life like flowers underwater. With De Palma, like Hitchcock, Hitchcock said the shooting was the least interesting and most disappointing part of a movie. You find directors like that, like Fincher, where it's all about getting the shot, and it's all about getting the shot in a way where you don't lose your initial idea of the shot. And with a director like Brian De Palma, the idea of the shot prior to shooting is very, very strong. There are other directors who don't decide what they're going to shoot until they're on the set, right?
mm.
They just come to they need to be in the physical location in order to figure out how to do it. And one of those guys is Cronenberg. I think Steven Soderbergh works that way to a certain extent. And I think for directors like that, I won't say it's easier, but there's not that anxiety of having a preconceived idea of a shot, and then once you're in the reality of the location or the studio, you're not going to get it.
Surprisingly, Malik definitely, and also Kubrick surprisingly had that. He needed to be in situ and looking around before he could decide what he was going to shoot.
Right, except with Kubrick, the in situ, needed 6 months of preparation and building that he was supervising the whole time. He was, if you read about the lighting and the set construction on The Shining, there's some great interviews with John Alcott where it's all about problem solving, and he's always, overlooking it.
How did you
Overlooking. God, I said overlooking about
overlooking because it's
no,
The
no,
Shining? I see what you did there. Yeah,
no,
you did it on
no.
purpose. Come on.
I did not do it on purpose, but I did do it to my eternal shame.
You interviewed De Palma for the book. I imagine you've interviewed him in the past, right?
No, this is our first time, and happily we got along well. De Palma knows how to do interviews. He knows how to go along, but he is also a guy who does not suffer fools gladly, and he's at a point in his life where he doesn't need to do this. So I began with a little bit of apprehension, and the first time we spoke, I was very happy to have gotten an hour with him where he didn't say, that was an imbecilic question. So that was great. And then we spoke a second time, and it was more relaxed and just as gratifying. And when he read the book, he sent me a very complimentary email. So my process with Brian was great. He needed a little persuasion. He didn't think people were interested in Scarface from this angle. And I had told him of my experience with Made Men and the book having done relatively well commercially, and that sold him on it to a certain extent. My friend Jay Cox was very helpful in helping me out in terms of communicating with Brian, and Jay figures in the book. in a very funny chapter about how the movie got its R rating.
Yeah, yeah, where he insists that he would show his 10-year-old this as a sort of
Right. It's a socially relevant movie that every child in the country should see. It's worth the way Jay tells it. I hope people go out and get the book and read it because it is extremely funny. And yeah, as he narrates this, as he gives me this narrative, he says to me, "Glenn, you're going to lose all respect for me." But I'm like, "No, Jay, I've only gained in respect, frankly."
So he was basically bullshitting in order to just get the R rating.
Yeah, no, he had no intention of letting his kid see the movie. Interestingly enough, his kid grew up to be a prosecutor, so he did see the movie at a certain point and perhaps was inspired.
One of the other points that I thought was interesting about about your how the film has kind of aged, or how it's not necessarily aged, but how it's relevant today, perhaps is a better way of saying it, is that very beginning has a very Trumpy feel, something that you point out in the book.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's deliberately Trumpy or reactionary. And they did. There's a little prologue saying, about the Mariel boat lift, such as what was it called? But whatever it was, this, Castro explicitly said, yeah, but Mariel boat lift. There's footage of a Castro speech saying these people, we don't want them because they're opposed to the revolution. A lot of people who stayed in Cuba, the Western propaganda, and it is propaganda, has painted, Cuba in the Castro regime as a land of unalloyed misery, and certainly in a lot of respects, there were disadvantages and a lot of human rights violations. But this ignores the fact that there are a lot of Cuban citizens who regard themselves as who during the Castro regime believed in the revolution and regarded themselves as enabling the revolution as a long-term process. If you want a better understanding of this, film to watch is Olivier Assayas's Underseen and Underrated WASP Network.
Mm.
But you know, yeah, the Mariel boat lift. What's the crawl says 100,000 came over and approximately 25,000 had criminal records. So they're trying to make it a fair kind of representation. But certainly, I can see Donald Trump watching that film, and he's watched this movie, and sort of inspiring that little speech. They're not sending their best people, and he still presses on that. He says they're sending people from insane asylum and prisons, and that complete nobody's sending anybody, by the way. And no, it's crazy. So without necessarily intending to, I think the film had provided a meme for Trump to exploit, to be sure.
When it comes to the reputation of this film, I was thinking as well, just when you talked about Brian De Palma just now and how he thought maybe nobody will be interested in a book of this nature, or Scarface in particular, it seems to be a theme that the people actually involved in making the film are kind of a bit baffled by its reputation and by its size in the sort of cultural consciousness.
Certainly, the hip hop embrace has bemused both De Palma and Stone. I'm sure that if somebody offered Pacino the opportunity to do a hip hop cameo and the price was right, he'd probably do it. Michelle Pfeiffer is kind of still has her was in Georgia for an event, and her driver was going on about Scarface and saying, hey, I can do all the dialogue from Scarface. Want to hear it? And she's like, okay. Because what are you going to say? But yeah, I think because the box office was not super great when it came out, there was some apprehension about it having a half-life, and it's two things made it two things made it resonate was the hip hop embrace, and then the home video release which sold more. It was the number one selling home video release of all time for a brief period, and that's when Universal really started getting the getting getting the money, and so that was pretty terrific.
That's exactly how I saw it. I remember it coming out, video rental around about that time with, The Shining and films of that nature, The Exterminator and
Sure,
Rambo
yeah,
and all
yeah,
that.
yeah.
And so sort of it always was on the shelves in that sort of way. And it had this reputation. I mean, I'm also interested, there's something that you talk about in terms of what they leave out in the Oliver Stone. And I'd already rewatched the film, half of the film, and I was finishing off the book, and it came onto this part before I finished rewatching it last night. I was thinking, oh, there's really a lot missing to the career of the criminal here. There's a lot of ellipses. There's a lot of jumps 6 months later, 2 years later, and you don't have those scenes in which Tony learns how to do this. Tony has a near miss with the police. It sort of really leaps from the hotel to him being a more established criminal figure to him being a really established criminal figure in kind of leaps and bounds.
It does, but you don't, not so you notice. I mean, everything definitely makes sense. What's interesting is that they have that whole business of meeting Frank and I'm going to be with Frank, and then they just cut to 3 months later, and they're definitely in the same place. They're not the point of having it be 3 months later is to show that they're not. They've got better clothes, they've got better circumstances. He's been able to buy that ridiculous Cadillac, but they're not better off in terms of their material, in terms of their situation relative to being anything but cogs in Frank's wheel. That whole scene at the Fontainebleau, the beach portion of the Fontainebleau Hotel, where Manny tries to pick up girls. They're just sort of goofing around, and that's the whole point. It's sort of like they're in stasis. And so, there's a certain amount of time before Tony makes his move. And then Tony does make his move. And we see, we do see exactly what happens. He's kind of he's kind of on the side. He's luck is on his side because it's here that Omar gets eliminated, which is both personally gratifying for Frank and gratifying in a business end for Frank, because it enables him to do this negotiation with Sosa, which nevertheless irritates Frank to no end, and reveals the breach with Frank. So I think it's reasonably detailed about Tony's machinations, and also how they play into whatever Tony's sense of loyalty is. He says to Frank that he's going to be loyal, and he's loyal up to a point, but he wants what he wants, and he wants two things: he wants Elvira, and he wants more power.
Mm.
And as soon as he finds an excuse to break with Frank, he takes it. So I think in terms of process, it's not these things are not inexplicable in themselves, despite the jumps in the temporal shifts.
Yeah, and that wonderful scene where he gets rid of Frank and then he gets rid of the cop, and I think you describe it as the most explosive FU.
Yeah, no, when he said when Mel Bernstein, the cop. The thing that makes Tony Montana win up until the point that he doesn't is the fact that he just will not behave according to any set of rules. Even Frank Lopez respects the idea of, not killing cops. He respects the idea of paying off corrupt cops for protection. Tony Montana has no such respect. He does not care, to the extent that we're almost surprised that he doesn't kill the banker. But yeah, the reason that he becomes the icon of crime that he is because he will do anything that he deems fit at the moment to get ahead or to gratify himself or to show the other person that he's boss. Showing Mel that he's boss doesn't really last because he kills Mel. You have a lot of other choices of dealing with Mel. If you were a more Machiavellian and less feral, you would find a way to bring Mel to heel, after having scared him to death. But no, Tony's just going to kill him.
It's interesting that there's a parallel there with the other great gangster movie, The Godfather, where there's a in the middle of both films, there's a killing of a cop, and in both films, it's stated you can't kill a cop. And it's, where's it written?
Yeah.
Pacino says in both films, more or less.
In both films, it's personal. It's personal. You injured, you know, you injured my father in The Godfather, which is a little more legitimate. And here it's you injured my sense of pride. You tried to boss me around. You don't boss me around. Again, you can actually make that point without killing the guy, but then you can never trust him either. So that plays into Montana's sense of loyalty, which becomes, very isolated at a certain point where he's sitting in the bathtub saying, "Who put this together? Me. Who do I trust? Me." It turns out he can't even trust Manny. I don't think Manny marrying Gina is, a terrible thing. Well, it turned out to be a terrible thing. His intentions were sincere and honorable, but he still is betraying Tony because Tony told him right off, she's not for you.
Mm, mm. And so that also strikes me as a
Very
sort of
Hobbesian kind of existence, right? Yeah.
yeah, blood and red in tooth and claw
Yeah.
and nasty
Yeah.
short and all the rest of it. And that also strikes me as a callback to a sort of white heat Jimmy Cagney having a morbid affection for his mother.
A morbid affection for his mother, but it also calls back to the 1932 Scarface, where either Howard Hawks or Ben Hecht, they both take credit because they want to look highbrow, bringing in this classical, Renaissance reference to the Borgias and the incest in the Borgia family, and making Tony hot for his sister. Interestingly enough, according to Stephen Bauer, this was the one thing where Pacino kind of drew the line. He was very averse to overtly playing lusting after Gina. He thought that was a bridge too far for Tony Montana. But the thing is, Pacino really has no say in the matter because DePalma, as a cinematic stylist, all he has to do in that nightclub scene is do the cutting from Tony's intense eyes to the close-up of the other guy's hand on Gina's ass, and you have it all right there. Pacino doesn't have to play anything. But it is the reason why Pacino acts so particularly stunned when Gina finally comes in and confronts him and says, "Oh, you want me? Come and get me." And he's like, "What are you talking about?" And to Pacino, that's exactly right. But he's also completely high on drugs, so maybe he thinks he's hallucinating. And it's certainly not the time to take advantage of the offer. So the reaction where he's completely incomprehending of Gina's demands makes sense.
And it's also like it's almost that part reminds me more of a horror movie when he he
Yes.
looks at he looks at her and there's this chord in the Babylon, the sort of like ding that Giorgio Moroder puts in, and it's almost like something out of a giallo, a zoom and a discordant madness indicating chord.
Uh-huh. Yes, very much so. Um, yeah, he's really gone over the. Jay Cox said this is a movie you could call over the top, except there's no top. And because De Palma is also a maestro of horror, he can hit those horror notes very strongly when he intends to. And yeah, at that point we have especially with the sexual angle, her robe hanging open. You almost see the thing that Tony's been, lusting after all this time. And yeah, it's definitely notes of giallo.
When it comes to that final shootout, then let's talk about that a little bit. And it has this grand operatic feel. It has this sense that it's taken, as you state, it takes ages for them to actually set up and do. It's kind of dangerous for them to do as well. There's so many guns on the set that they've got to be very careful about. And it's so over the top. It's as you just said with the Jay Cox quotation. Is there even a top to this? How do you think that? What was the conception of that? How did De Palma think? Right, I'm just going to make the biggest shootout. Is it the Wild Bunch that's coming to mind here?
It was a couple of things. I think he had the production values right there, the interior, the set, the whole thing, and he also had time. he had time away from Al Pacino because Al Pacino burned his hand on the muzzle of the gun that he was shooting. It's not shooting real ammo, but it's shooting enough incendiary material to create those muzzle flashes. And in the excitement of doing it, he grabbed the muzzle and burned his hand and had to go to the hospital. DePalma is without the guy for this scene, so he just keeps shooting. And it's yeah, and he makes it more and more and more and more and more. And yeah, he rumors have started that Steven Spielberg helped him out. He didn't. Steven is Brian De Palma's great friend. He was on the universe a lot. The way Pacino at the 92nd Street Y is sitting there and he's talking about, I was in the hospital and they kept shooting the scene. They brought Steven Spielberg in. And I'm like thinking, yeah, Brian De Palma doesn't subcontract his shots. I don't think they brought Steven Spielberg in. What happened was, and De Palma was very diplomatic when I brought it up. He says, that's not my recollection. What happened was Steven came by. He was on the lot and he had, I told, I had several cameras doing this one bit of business, and I told him to check on camera 4. And he went and he checked on camera 4 and he told me, yeah, it went off. So that was it. That's Steven Spielberg's contribution to
basically looking at a monitor and making sure everything was in frame that he wanted. So now you've written a book, Made Men, about Goodfellas, and you've written a book about Scarface. What is this? Have you got a third sort? Do you want to do a gangster film trilogy, or because you're cornering the market, man?
Well, no, my next book I cannot talk about, but it is in the works, and it will not be a gangster film, but it will be a genre film. And by genre film, I mean genre like Western, horror film, gangster film, noir, whatever. This book started out, I wanted to do something counterintuitive, and I started out writing a book about a rom-com, and 6 months in, had to pull the plug on that for a variety of reasons. One thing I decided in the wake of that is do not be counterintuitive. Right where, and I'm comfortable with gangster, I said, there's nothing wrong with writing books about gangster movies, and making that, God forbid, making that your brand. Now this is, but I'm going to write about films that I have a passion for, as opposed to doing things because they're interesting. Right. And there's a lot of films I have a passion for, so I don't feel, unduly constrained by this idea. The next book is going to be a horror movie, and I'm doing my research now, and I think it's going to be a blast. And it's in the same vein because it's going to be a horror movie that is still very resonant, and usually maybe the most influential film of all the films I've written about so far.
All right. Now, I'm not going to guess and break your NDA.
Thank you.
Just one last question then, Glenn. You've been on before. You were actually, I think you might even have been on like the second episode I did of Writers on Film, and we're 150 episodes in.
Yeah. Wow. That's incredible. Congratulations. That's a long time ago, I guess.
The fact you've had time to write half a book about a rom-com and then an entire book and then publish a book about a gangster movie shows how long the podcast has been running.
Yeah. Damn. Well, hopefully it'll still be running when the next book happens. I'm due to deliver it in December of 2025. So let's look to 2026 to speak again on a podcast. I know we'll speak again in many other contexts in the meantime.
One thing I wanted to ask you before you go, though, is a film book recommendation. I know you gave me one last time we spoke, but you must have read some film books since then.
I have. I'd recommend Tarantino's Cinema Speculation, but that's a book that really ticks people off a lot, and people think he's insane, which is, to me, part of the appeal of the book. It's a film book I've read recently. I also recommend anything by Tim Lucas. So his book about Spirits of the Dead is fantastic. That's a European publisher. You know what? Here you go. It's a novel by Jeffrey O'Brien, who's a genius and a saint, and it's called Arabian Nights of 1934. And it's all about the pre-code movies that his parents watched before he was born when they were both young. And it's fantastic. And it'll put you on a jag of pre-code movie. You'll go out and you'll buy every Forbidden Hollywood DVD selection, and it'll be worth it.
Oh, that sounds brilliant. Okay, thank you for that.
It's gorgeous, it's poetic, it's romantic, it's profoundly moving, and it's also a lot of fun.
Excellent. Well, I'll definitely get that on my reading list, and I hope our listeners will too. Thanks, Glenn. It's been wonderful to read your book, wonderful to talk to you again, and I can't wait for the next one.
Thank you so much. I'm always happy to talk to you.